Yeah, in my mind, I kind of reframed the lecture a little bit. So, although it's about reclaiming agency and moral disarmament, what the lecture is really all about is why we have to fight the culture wars. And the reason why I did that was partially because of an experience that I had fairly recently, in fact, a day ago or maybe a day and a half ago, which was I tweeted my support for Kemi Badenoch, and on the ground that she's a really feisty culture warrior. And somebody whose name is Paul Doe, he might be here, that's D-O-E, replied, ironically, the homeless and those in the food banks talk of nothing else. So the irony was that here I am, Frank Furedi, a puffed up professor, talking about the culture wars, but the real people, the salt of the earth who are hanging around the food banks and are homeless, talk of nothing else. Ha 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 ha. The implication being is that the political agenda should be set by people as they are going into the food banks because they know what is really important, rather than people who imagine, from his perspective, wrongly that the culture and the wars around basic foundational values may have some significance for our lives. Before I go on to say as to why I think these wars are quite important, I should say that very often, whether we like it or not, we get involved in battles that are not of our own choosing. Nobody necessarily, certainly I, have no real desire to get involved in a conflict over values. That's not why I was brought into this earth, and that's really not something I ever imagined 20, 25, 30 years ago I would have to do. But then there are circumstances that are created that kind of acquire a dynamic of its own. And you really cannot ignore the import of what's taking place. And you have to either pretend it's not happening, or alternatively you have to kind of take sides and get involved in these battles. Having said that, I think there should be a bit of a health warning here, which is that very often there's a danger that when you get involved in a conflict over values, you become a caricature of yourself. You become really responsive. You do end up almost seeing things in very simplistic black and white terms and not understand the specificity, the context within which certain kinds of debates occur. And that goes on for everything we've been discussing. The war in the Ukraine it's not the case of the war in the Ukraine that on one side there are angels and on the other side there is the devil. There is a much more complex dynamic at work there. And it's not the case that one uncritically simply gets stuck in and imagine that you're fighting this holy crusade against the infidels. Because if you do that, then you do begin to lose sight precisely of those kinds of values that are worth fighting for, that are important for the human journey, the human experience as we move into the future. So I just want to kind of emphasize that this is not necessarily a fight that we want to be involved in, but it's not of our own making. We didn't decide to have, for example, battles about pronouns. I never imagined that one day this is something that I would have to think very much about. Pronouns are not my strong points in any case, because of my own ambivalence about who I am. Yeah. But there you go. Now, one of the reasons why I kind of reshaped the lecture is because so many people that I encounter, and I had a series of debates on this, often come up with this statement, which more or less goes like this, that the culture war is a distraction from the really important issues. I don't know if you came across that assertion, that somehow there are these really meaty, absolutely crucial issues, that are more down to earth, they're more material, they're more economic, they're about class. And really, the culture war is for pussies. I mean, the culture war is really for people, who are in some shape or form are not able to understand the real issues at stake. So it's a distraction. And there's been a series of articles in the New York Times and in The Guardian and in the New Statesman, all of them more or less making that kind of assertion. I just spilled some water. I don't know if it's a problem for this machine that's here, that's surveying me. Maybe I'm getting too excited with this. Yeah.
Speak up, Frank.
Yeah. All right. So that's really what I think is quite important to kind of engage with this. Now, I would claim that rather than the culture war being a distraction from quality of life issues, the cost of living or class and well-being, culture is deeply implicated and is quite intricately interweaving with those kinds of issues. And very often you will find that there's the silent conflict between classes and social groups within society often takes a cultural form. And you find that, for example, very, very clearly in the divisions during the pandemic, where you could pretty much, determine in advance who would be enthusiastic about wearing masks and who wouldn't be. And very often, this wasn't just an individual arbitrary decision. There was a very clear social grouping that would react one way or the other. And similarly, you could pretty much tell in advance what kind of people would be for vaccinations and what kind of people would be very skeptical and hostile to it, and which kind of people wouldn't. And in many respects, what we see here is the embrace of a certain cultural orientation through which these kinds of responses and these kinds of reactions occur. And we know very, very clearly that the culture wars, for example, in the United States, where things have crystallized a lot more, are very much based upon different class positions and very much are linked to different positions between social groupings. So in that sense, the idea that somehow cultural conflicts and cultural issues are a distraction from the down-to-earth struggles that are taking place over the distribution of resources or about the way that society is run, I think is very, very simplistic. In a polarized way of interpreting the relation of culture to political reality, that kind of polarization between the two, we overlook the fact that how human beings see the world, or the ideal of what a human being should be, or what people should value, and what they should expect out of life, we find that all those perceptions are mediated through culture. The way that human beings see in the world isn't just simply a physical act. You put on a glass and you see in a particular kind of a way. It's very much shaped and framed by the kind of values that inform your everyday existence. And in particular, when there are conflicts over those values, then I think very often the differences between people over quite remote issues that are very remote from the cultural domain, are still interconnected because of the mediating effect that culture plays. So therefore, I would argue that culture is, in a sense, is interweaved with every issue that is labeled political or economic or whatever particular label you're interested in. And in particular, human subjectivity and consciousness, which are obviously influenced by material circumstances, are nevertheless perceived, and the meaning is given to them through the way that the web of meaning that culture provides for us allows us to interact with that. So, for example, I would suggest that very often what is seen as real by some groups and seen as unreal by other groups, when you have two different realities clashing, or again, not 100 million miles away from the way that culture intersects with people's everyday existence. So people of my generation often laugh when they hear transgenderist ideology declare that women can have penises. Right? And they think it's very funny, and they joke, and how could people say that? Right? As far as they're concerned, that's absurd. Right? Whereas, at the same time, they don't realize that the people who actually say this possess an outlook and a cultural sensibility which can actually, at the level of perception, go so far as to negate biological reality. So from that standpoint, a biological reality that's been in place for thousands of years can be seen as somehow wrong and false and even artificially created in order to oppress people. And if biological reality can be so readily marginalized, and if biological reality can be so easily negated and reinterpreted in a radically new fashion, then you can see very, very clearly that what we see as the material reality or the biological reality, or anything that's almost physical, is not something that is independent and exists in isolation from the meaning that people give to them and the meaning that culture says about them. So what I'm really saying is that what is real is not a million miles away from what culture says about it. In particular, at the present moment, these developments are quite significant in relation to the conflict over language. Now again, I remember the days when people used to laugh at the new words that came in. I mean, I'm so old that I remember the jokes that people had about the introduction of words like chairperson instead of chairman. And I just remember the absurdity that many of us thought that, who's this chairperson? I remember in my department we used to have jokes, why don't we just call them chairs, and whatever. And that was to us, a joke. That's how we kind of reacted to us. Whereas now, nobody on television, nobody in a film would actually talk about chairman unless it's a historical drama unfolding in 1920 or something like that. And the reality changes. Now, you might think it's just a word that changes, but as words change in a number of different settings, then the way we perceive the world actually alters, because language and the ability to control and direct language in a particular way does give people a capacity to change, or at the very least fundamentally challenge the way that we think. So thought itself is in a sense communicated and expresses itself through words. And the struggle over words is something that is fundamental in relation to any of the political or socio-economic issues that we are confronted with. Now, the point I'm arguing is not that culture trumps economics or politics. I'm not arguing a cultural determinist position. I don't think it is the case that culture is determines politics or economics. Rather, what I'm trying to suggest is that these different dimensions of the human experience are totally interconnected. And what I also want to argue is that at different times in our history, one of these dimensions becomes much more significant in the way that issues are posed and issues are resolved than other times. And I'm not arguing that cultural issues and the cultural war or conflicts over values have the same significance in a different historical epoch. I'm not arguing that in 1848 or in 1905 this was the principal terrain on which the important struggles of the time were being fought out. All I'm saying is that now, today, in the early 21st century, these questions acquire a significance that trumps all the other conflicts that are occurring because of the influence that they bear down upon it. So it seems to me that this is particularly significant in relation to our discussion in the last couple of days, because culture and the meanings humans attach to those experiences that are cultural influences the way we think about politics and social issues. And most important of all, I think this is really the nub of the matter, cultural attitudes also influence how we think about ourselves, our subjectivity, and our capacity for agency. Right? Because every culture and the conflicts that pertain within culture are also statements about who we are as human beings and what we are expected to be able to do and what we are expected to be able to achieve. And that has an important implication in the way we sort of think about ourselves. The reason why I think it's important to fight the culture war is because it is indirectly a struggle regarding human subjectivity and its potential. And what it also is a kind of issue to do with whether or not we have the confidence in ourselves to actually have agency. And I want to kind of explore that a little bit more. Do we have the capacity for agency given what culture sort of communicates in relation to that? I think that the reason why the conflict of culture is important now is because, as I tried to argue earlier on, after decades of targeting the principal values associated with the tradition of Western culture, those values have become deprived of their commanding influence. And almost every single historical experience that was significant in informing the way we understand the world and which served as a cumulative resource on which we were able to draw for decades and decades and decades, have been to some extent undermined and weakened. And whether we like it or not, when a society and when individuals become detached from their past, their confidence in their place in the world is undermined. And I think that, whenever people talk in that kind of negative, pessimistic way that you see all the time, and whenever you hear those nihilistic expressions communicated, what they are really talking about is the way they see themselves in relation to the world around them. And whenever they emphasize their passive and kind of semi-paralyzed way of being, what they are really indicating is that they really haven't got very much confidence about their ability to change the world. I think that's something that kind of comes out of this in a very significant sense. And it seems to me that when those people that say that the culture world is not significant, it is a distraction, they overlook the fact that our ability to deal with what they call the cost of living issues affecting people's circumstances, our ability to solve those kinds of problems requires a self-confident public. And all the grievous harms that have been inflicted on our society, not just in Britain but elsewhere, require solutions that can only be provided by people who actually believe in themselves to some extent. And that is something that is really important, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about the culture wars may take the form of being about pronouns and about gender and all these issues, but ultimately the cultural wars that are being fought out now are principally about freedom. It's about whether we live in a free society, and at a more basic level, they're about whether we see ourselves as being able or wanting to be able to live freely. And that seems to me to be the key issue here, because at the moment, the other side that we're fighting against wants to, in a sense, trade away those kinds of freedom, or at least is very casual about the way they regard those freedoms altogether. So one of the casualties of the cultural war so far has been confidence in the capacity of human agency to influence their destiny and the destiny of mankind. Now, why is that? I think the reason for that is because the consciousness of agency, the consciousness of subjectivity, is directly related to historical consciousness. And we talked about historical consciousness at the very beginning of our discussion. But historical consciousness encompasses within it a vision about change and about the possibility of change. A vision that sort of also sort of brings to the fore the role of human beings within the process of change itself. Because if we see change merely as something that happens mechanically, something that is entirely external to our experience, if we sort of have broken down the temporal distinctions between the past and the present and the future, then of course what we've done is we've annihilated the role of human subjectivity within this great kind of process. And it seems to me that in the absence of historical consciousness, and I do mean historical consciousness in the sense of seeing sort of the specific moment of our existence in a very distinctive way in relation to what has gone on in the past, whilst at the same time understanding and appreciating the organic links that kind of binds us together to an era that that has existed before. Unless we see that, our own capacity to see us as the makers or the influencers of our circumstances becomes very feeble. It becomes very diminished in that kind of a way. The anti-historical sentiments, the sentiments that deny historical consciousness, or at least negate its exercise, its possibility, is a very strong presentist mode, a presentist style, which I think is the dominant cultural mode at the moment. And presentism, the form that presentism takes today in terms of everyday existence is that of fatalism. And I don't think there's ever been a time in modern history where fatalism had such a strong, powerful presence within our world, where different forms of determinisms are just accepted as common sense. And that kind of determinism can be anything from neurodeterminism, where people tell you that the way your brain works determines your personality, to the role of psychology in suggesting to us that we have different kinds of personalities, we learn and educate ourselves differently, and influences basically who we are, to biological determinism, all the way to the old-fashioned economic determinisms and all the rest of that. So when you actually look at it, whereas in the 19th century you might have had economic determinism and maybe biological determinism, 2 or 3 forms of determinism that vied against each other in terms of influence, today it's kind of countless ways that our fate has been decided for us by forces that are essentially predetermined. It's the predetermined element that is really sort of quite important. And fatalism is no longer what it used to be, where you had those kind of religious ideals about fate or fortuna that was seen as something that the gods sort of were responsible for, ideals that were kind of linked to that. Fatalism today basically is justified in everyday life to the very simple argument that is used time and time again, which basically says change has accelerated beyond human control. We live in a world where what was true yesterday becomes irrelevant today. A lot of people argue that there is no point in teaching young kids facts, because by the time they finish school, they would be completely irrelevant. And therefore, all that we could teach people, and people actually argue this, both in the business management theories, but also in pedagogy and elsewhere, the best thing that we can teach people is to react to change. The best thing that we can teach people is to be flexible, right? The best thing that we can teach people is to basically roll with it. And that's really and that's why you have all these arguments about flexibility and smart business. I forget what that business jargon is. Smart business that are lean and can react and everything else. And basically what they're saying is these are really important accomplishments that we need to have instead of learning about the past and about its legacy. And if we can do that, then we can survive as a human species. So that kind of determinism, which I suppose is most strikingly expressed through the mantra of globalization. Globalization is runaway world, that we can never really catch up with, or is alternatively summed up in environmentalism, that unless we do something now, human extinction is inevitable, and all that we can do is basically follow this prescription towards the net zero kind of ideal. And even at that point, we have to live in accordance to forces that are entirely beyond our control. That kind of sensibility could not have arisen, could not have emerged without the erosion of our sense of temporality, without the erosion of the temporal distinctions between the past and the present and the future. And that is why when we talked about historical amnesia yesterday, it is so crucially important. Because if you have this ever-expanding present into what we used to call the past, and ever-extending present into what we see as the future, if that's the world that we live in, then what happens inevitably, and this is where fatalism is so pernicious, is we begin to think about the future in the way that we used to think about the past. Because the way we used to think about the past was that the past is gone. The past is the past. The past cannot be changed. It already happens. Right? That's the way we used to think about it. Whereas now what we think is that the future is something that influences us now. Right? The role of the future is to influence us here in the present, but there isn't very much that we can do to make our future or to change our future. That argument is most strikingly expressed in that discussion that Jenny was talking about yesterday, about the importance of doing stuff for the future generations. That somehow the future generations are hovering over us in the here and now, and they're telling us how to behave in order to live up to their expectations. But at the same time, as we're doing our best to help out the future generations, there's nothing that we can do to change our future. And that kind of temporal discourse that is now so powerful is really quite important in the way that we live. And we live in a world where the future shapes our lives in the here and now. So when the past is on the one hand a done deal, and the future is a done deal, what we're left with is our presentist imagination in the here and now, where we are not really expected to do very much that creates a different kind of world than the one that we're living here. I think that what we're asked to do by the contemporary forces of fatalism is to be, at best, on the right side of history. I think that's really how history seems to work from this sensibility. So when we're told to be, when people say you better change your mind and be on the right side of history. Or when you say something that people disagree with, they say, Frank, you're obviously not on the right side of history, right? What they are really saying is that the history that is that is happening, on which you can be on the right side of, is leaving the station at 4:30, right? So history becomes like this kind of movement, this mechanical movement forward, with its values and its attitudes that you have got to sign up to, because it's already been decided somewhere along the way that this is what is right. They never say who decides what is right. They very rarely explain to you. There are no books written about who wrote the right side of history, and how that was kind of constructed. And that's not surprising, because the right side of history, like history itself, in that kind of mechanical way, is not a human accomplishment. It wasn't human beings that created history. History is something that is as mechanical or as physical or as non-human as many of the climatic changes that occur sort of without any direct sort of input from us. And when you have that kind of notion, then it does become actually quite scary. And the reason why that fatalism is so pernicious is because its logic is to take away our freedom in all kinds of different spheres of our lives. In many ways, if you want to look at the way that this works, you saw this during the pandemic, where we kind of depicted humanity as at the permanent mercy of a virus. And somehow this virus, which was telling us how to live our lives. So the virus wasn't just simply a threat to our health, which it was. The virus became this kind of biological expression of fate, who could determine what we could and couldn't do in the most prescriptive of ways. And when you look back on the lockdown experience, you saw how prescriptive it could become. But you also saw, and this is where fatalism is so dangerous, is that once the fate was accepted, once fatalism was accepted, people were so willing to give up their freedom. Right? I mean, sensible, intelligent people all of a sudden imagined that ideals about living freely no longer mattered or no longer an issue, or they believed that this was something they could temporarily give up altogether, because it could be brought back into the mix a little bit kind of later on. Now this matters, and it matters very much, because if fate and fatalism as a kind of expression of our cultural outlook is so powerful, and we're at the mercy of fate in that kind of sense, then what we are really saying is that the things that are really important occur without any input from us human beings, without any input from agency. And of course, if the exercise of subjectivity is no longer of any significance in the way that our life is expressed and is lived, what also means is things like things like self-determination or autonomy, human autonomy, become entirely irrelevant. They have no significance. How can you talk about self-determination or moral autonomy when the capacity for doing things and taking responsibility for things, because you can only take responsibility for the things that you've decided to do, sort of become diminished and have no real significance. I mean, how can you have a real sense of responsibility if what happens is not of your own making? You can't really do that. And if autonomy and self-determination become so irrelevant, then what we're saying is that moral freedom itself becomes emptied of meaning. Because how can you be morally free if you weren't in any shape or form responsible for this? So without the authority of moral freedom, morality itself becomes either a form of dogma, where you simply repeat, the God said this, or so and so said that. So a moral sort of morality itself either becomes a form of dogma, or it becomes a set of administratively created values promoted by technocrats and culture warriors. And I think that's, when that occurs, what in effect happens is that freedom becomes emptied of its content. Freedom becomes entirely emptied of its real lived meaning in that shape or form. So for me, the culture wars that are happening around us serves as an invitation to rethink what freedom is really all about. And it forces us to no longer take freedom for granted, but to give an account of what being free really means in the 21st century. I think that's the best contribution that one can make, because if our moral freedom becomes a negotiable commodity, something that we're very casual about, under those circumstances, what you have is a very significant and very important development. I think the fact that we are so easily giving up on free speech, I don't mean people in this room, but within our society, is a significance of this. The way in which judgment has given way to non-judgmentalism is, again, really, really quite important. And when you have a situation where moral freedom, human agency, become a shadow of their Enlightenment version, then what you are really talking about is moral disarmament. And I think the moral disarmament of Western society is truly a scary and certainly for me frightening development. For me, moral disarmament is the outcome of a crisis of normativity, and more importantly, a refusal to confront that crisis. I think it's one thing to struggle about values and about morality. There's nothing really wrong with that, but when you refuse to confront that, or even to recognize that that's a problem, because it's not as significant as cost of living issues or what happens in food banks, when you have that kind of narrow vision about something that shapes the way we see the world so fundamentally, then we have a very, very significant and very important problem. Because in a sense what we're saying is that we are halfway to giving up freedoms that were fought for centuries and were really quite important. Because moral disarmament is not just simply about not talking about evil and what is good. It is simply in practice not taking our freedoms very, very seriously, being casual about something that is, in a sense, critical to our human development. I think that we see moral disarmament in a number of ways, and I became particularly aware of the significance of moral disarmament in relation to the war in Ukraine. Because when I went to Ukraine or when I read about Ukraine, I saw with my own eyes what happens if you don't take freedom seriously. If you, for example, don't take freedom seriously, then you might not want to fight for those freedoms. Right? And it begins in small things. You basically start censoring yourself in a university because you think that speaking freely is too much of a hassle. Right? It's too much of a hassle, it's an inconvenience. And you get into the habit of censoring yourself all the time. After a while, you wake up one morning, you will say, well, when somebody attacks you and crosses your border and threatens you, so that's not that important because life still continues. Right? That kind of connection from freedom and the encroachment on it in the here and now with the big geopolitical issues are actually very, very real. And you see that, for example, in Germany. Or in Germany, you got all these what I call post-heroic professional academics, who are, loved the European Union and who believed that the high point of human civilization, the temple of human civilization, is located somewhere in Brussels, and who think that people who take national sovereignty, who take populism seriously, are a lower form of human life because that's what they are like, and who believe in the values of diversity and inclusion, and who think that every gender must have its say, and who love the fact of pointing out to you that there are more genders now than there were last year. And that's really good. That's really good because it's a testimony to their sensitivity. We now recognize what history has denied 100 years ago. The very same people with this kind of mentality are also adopted what Habermas, who probably is the personification of all these trends, sees a kind of post-heroism, that Germany is beyond, has now gone beyond the tawdry past, where people actually thought that it was necessary to have an army. What a joke! Why would you need an army in a nation state where people actually thought it was important to have masculine courage? This is just crazy. We don't need to have that kind of courage anymore. When you read what they're saying about the war in the Ukraine, it's really quite interesting, because what Habermas says, yes, it is true that the Ukrainians are fighting in a way that we in Germany didn't think is possible, right? You have to remember that the head of the German army, I told the Ukrainians when the war, because the Ukrainians asked them for some help, and they told the Ukrainians, well, there's no point helping you because you're going to be defeated in 2 days. I mean, that was their kind of reaction. So it's actually quite pointless to help you out on this. Now, I don't know, 140 or whatever days afterwards, you kind of wonder what they're saying. But anyway, so basically what Habermas is saying, it's really nice that the Ukrainians, I didn't think that, this could happen. But at the same time as saying that, he's resentful. Habermas is resentful of the fact that the Ukrainians are not prepared to empathize with Germany's reluctance to stop buying oil from Russia. Right? It doesn't, why are the Ukrainians so unreasonable? Right? Why don't you understand that we need to buy oil from Russia? That's what Habermas is saying, and what he's really getting at, in a sense, is that in his post-heroic world, the very glorifying of heroism in any of its form is something that is really wrong and should give way to the old German sort of conviction that the economy, trade, and commerce must go on no matter what happens in the battlefields, that these are the ways that things will be sort of connected. And I don't think it's just simply German academics who think like that. I think those sentiments are alive and well here in Britain and elsewhere, despite the fact that Britain played a slightly more active role in this war. Because I think what you'll find is that the values of heroism and risk aversion are so deeply embedded in our society that you really cannot trust anybody in our society to actually go out and fight. I mean, if they do, well and good, but that's not something you can take for granted. You can no longer take for granted that a risk-averse military force is going to behave anything like a military force. Now, you're probably saying that Frank is exaggerating, he's making things up. It's not like that in the real world. But if you want to know what the world looks like in a risk-averse, post-heroic mode, when the ability to fight is not legitimated, not culturally valued in any serious sense, look at those policemen in Texas, right? As they're checking out their mail on their phone, right? Looking at the time because they want to get back, for supper, while the kids are being killed just around the corner. I mean, that is, to me, something that is truly shocking. It is truly shocking. But then, of course, living in Britain, we should be used to that. just look at the way that the emergency workers responded to the bombings in Manchester. They call them first responders. I don't know if you ever heard that expression. We are the first responders. Well, if they're the first responders, you're going to have to wait a very, very long time for that kind of response, because in the real world, I'm sure that somebody else will respond before they will, given the kind of risk assessment they're forced to make, and quite happily make, in relation to all kinds of emergency sort of contexts. And I'm just making these points, not because I want to be very critical of these people. I'm not a particularly brave person myself. Know that I think I would have been too embarrassed to look at my phone, right? I think I probably would have found a different way, perhaps, of not intervening. But I do think that there's something wrong, fundamentally wrong, in the way that society now works. And that kind of problem has got to do with the way our moral sensibility has been influenced by the kind of cultural conflicts that we are. And when you have those kind of cultural mentalities, what we have is an invitation to lower our expectations, so that we live in a world that when it comes to heroism, the banal can become heroic. And the distinction between banality and heroism becomes increasingly less and less important. So that's really what I'm kind of concerned about. Now, what does that mean? I think that in fighting the culture wars, we've got to be smarter than the people that are involved on the two sides. I mean, I know what side I'm on. There's no doubt about that. But I think what has been a problem so far is that whenever anything to do with morality or anything to do with a sensible way of being is attacked, we react, right? And you have a situation continually where somebody comes along and says those words can no longer be used, and somebody in the Daily Mail writes an article reacting to it. And you have a situation where they basically indicate that our children should be subjected to this particular curriculum, which, for example, tells them that there's no real difference between boys and girls and men and women. A number of parents react to it. And that's been the mode now, literally since the early 1980s. And sometimes people say, how did you see this? Isn't this weird how stupid they are? But it's always been a reaction. The government says, universities, need to be free. It's almost like the Pope, sort of making some kind of declaration, a constant reaction to what has gone on. So what I would argue is that what we need to do is not to react, because the minute you react, you really are accepting the terms in which the culture war is being fought. You kind of, accepting the premise in the way that it's being posed. I think it's quite important for us to initiate. And I think the key thing in terms of the restoration of agency is the capacity of learning how to initiate what we find as being sort of truly important. And moral rearmament for me actually can only come about once we individually and collectively, through acts of solidarity, learn to initiate, so that we kind of create and establish the terms on which the discussion about values, about what is right and wrong, about the need to make judgments about stuff, it's on those terms that positive things can happen. I think that one of the interesting things, an example of this, that almost happened by accident, is the discussion around the candidates for the Tory party leadership. Because I think what happened, the only good thing that happened so far in this thing is when Kemi called out Penny Mordaunt. And she did it very ineffectively to begin with, in a very kind of hesitant kind of a way. But what happened was that, for the first time, you didn't wait for the Mordaunts of this world to talk to kind of lay down the law as to how we should see gender. You had the other thing posed on. This is what you said, Penny. This is what you believe in. And she says no, and the usual bullshit lying about it. And then gradually more and more people begin to pile in, and you put her on the defensive, and you put people like her on the defensive. And I think that's a very good model for us, where we, instead of waiting for the other side to lay down the law, we begin to lay down about what is sensible and what we expect of them. And because that's the only way in which the culture war can be fought in a way that is actually dynamic and forward-looking. We don't want to be reacting, and we don't want to be caricatures ourselves. We don't want to somehow create a dogma and a religion about the way we view our sensibility. We have to be open-minded, genuinely open-minded, not like they are, and not be dogmatic, but we also have to initiate. And I think that in the act of initiating, the key argument that we need to introduce into the culture war is freedom, right? So, and I do mean freedom. I don't just mean that whenever somebody is censored, we talk about free speech. Whenever people are shut down, what they call cancel culture, we kind of react against it. It's basically about broadening out the way that freedom is understood, broadening out the way that freedom is interpreted, so it isn't just simply something to do with legal matters, isn't just simply to do with kind of rights, what are our rights and what are not our rights. It's to do with the way we live our lives. Above all, it's to do with moral freedom. I think that's really quite important. And in particular, it's to do with conscience, because I think the main battleground in the culture war is the freedom of conscience. And I want to suggest to you that I don't want to wait until the attacks on the freedom of conscience become more explicit and more systematic. I think we have got to now begin to argue for the freedom of conscience on our terms before the big battles kind of confronting it begins to kick in. So coming to an end, without being endism, I'll go back to that quote that I ended my last talk on yesterday, in case you forgot it. So basically, Goethe says there are only two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. One of these is roots, and the other is wings. And I think you all understand what he's really saying here. But you can go a little bit a step further, because if you look at the origins of the word roots, and if you kind of explore the meaning of the word's roots, basically, it's related to the word radical. I mean, not for nothing is the word radical related to or proceeding from a root. And that kind of radical rootedness and the capacity to act radically is something that we need to think about in our own conscious way of reacting to things. So basically what I think for me comes out of this Goethe quote is the necessity for a radical reorientation that is rooted in our history, is rooted in a positive sense of temporality, but which radically affirms everything that we think is important, which basically means rather than being casual or modest, or rather than limiting our expectations, we have got to initiate and raise the stakes in the culture wars that are being fought out in the here and now. Thank you.